Good evening, everyone. Before I welcome all our guests, Advocate Jenkins, how are you doing tonight?
Good.
I was having a proposal that maybe we start with this issue on item number 3. Let it be the first one so that we can release Advocate Jenkins. Then we'll deal with the briefing later. How about that?
Chairperson, I agree and I move for with that amendment, Chairperson.
Yeah, so that this poor colleague, he has got so much to deal with so that he can rest. You don't know how many other matters is he dealing with. He didn't lobby me. I'm just trying to let him go so that we have our time with the colleagues from the NGOs then without rushing. Okay?
No, you are progressive person. Very progressive.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe it's the song that you were playing for me. I don't know. Now, having said that, dear colleagues, can I have a mover for the agenda, for the adoption of the agenda and the seconder?
Chairperson,
I think
for the adoption.
Paul, and I second the chair.
Okay. Thank you so much, dear colleagues. Let me then quickly deal with apologies if I have. The ones that I know is that one of the minister and the DG. And then on my side is understandable because they've been with us. I think we've been keeping them very busy so that they should then work. After all, what we're doing today is just parliament business. And as long as the parliamentary liaison officers are here, including the support staff and the people from the DG's office, I should think we'll be able to deal with that. And if there are matters that we want them to respond to, that can be done to them in writing. But I felt let's allow them to deal with the other business for the day. And then your hand is still up, Honorable Phillips. Is the old one or still the new one now?
Sorry, ma'am, it's an old hand. I'll take it down now.
Okay. You can remove the agenda from the screen. Yes. Thank you so much. Then we can then start with our meeting with that amendment. Having said that, I felt maybe let's start with this first so that we welcome all the colleagues from the NGOs. They will introduce themselves when the time arrives. Also to welcome you, Advocate Jenkins. But I felt we need to first deal with these issues before we proceed with the meeting. Colleagues, you'll recall that the meeting with environmental, non-governmental organizations is one of the strategic items on our committee program. As Parliament prepares itself to rise on Friday, there was so much temptation on our part to defer this engagement to early next year. But thanks to you, Honorable Singh, for that good guidance that we had to apply for permission to meet after hours so that we process this matter. We did that strongly because we felt strongly that this is important interaction with our local environmental and governmental organization, and it's a matter that couldn't be postponed. We have done that considering the vital role that NGOs play in the environmental protection landscape. It is in this context that we are meeting this evening with the Center for Environmental Rights. Colleagues, I want to appreciate you. You have been very busy, hard at work since morning, as you have heard Honorable Singh, but still, you still made it to be here. I want to say that the Center for Environmental Rights, it's a non-profit organization, and then it comprises of activists. There are activist lawyers who help our communities and civil society organization in South Africa to realize their constitutional right to a healthy environment by advocating and litigating for environmental justice. We hope to also meet with others tomorrow. But let me remind you, dear colleagues, that environmental NGOs play a very key role in helping to tackle the environmental issues in our country. They do so, they also do so in order to play a crucial role in helping to plug gaps by conducting research to facilitate policy development, building institutional capacity, and also facilitating independent dialogue with civil society to help the people live more sustainable lifestyles. It therefore, colleagues, cannot be disputed that we face profound environmental, social, and economic challenges, as well as developmental and natural resources constraints. Having a strong community at environment NGOs with a clear mandate to engage civil society, businesses, and the public sector help us in many respects to tackle these issues more successfully. However, we are also aware that environmental NGOs face many barriers in doing so, in carrying out their work, such as the lack of understanding about the role of their role in civil society, and public perception that the government alone is responsible for the well-being of its citizens and residents. Despite this limitation, we have a legal framework that recognizes environmental NGOs and enable them to access more diverse funding resources and high-level support from us legislatures. We also understand and appreciate the critical role that the environmental NGOs play in policy development and implementation of such policies. It is in this regard that we look forward to interacting with them today, and more of them as we'll be processing the climate change bill next year. As I've indicated earlier, we are going to first then get a presentation from Parliament's Legal Services on the Climate Justice Charter that was referred to this committee by the Deputy Speaker. This charter should be processed in terms of Section 234 of the Constitution that makes provision for charters of rights consistent with the Constitution to be adopted by Parliament. However, whether the current climate justice charter under consideration qualifies as one of those rights may require us, colleagues, collectively to apply our minds in the light of the legal advice on the matter. The bottom line is that we have to do something about this charter, and the decision on what to do or what not to do must just be reached by us. On what not to do must be reached by ourselves tonight. While we have to attend and to proceed to the proposed climate change charter, we also need colleagues to bear in mind of the content of the charter against the proposals outlined in the climate change bill that will be soon be coming to the committee. South Africa, as we speak, is taking active steps towards addressing climate change, and we are now at the stage of processing the climate change bill, which enables South Africa to create a legislative framework which will effectively implement appropriate national and climate action measures in both adaptation and mitigation. I will need to report that the department, which we do oversight on, has laid the foundation through the development of the National Climate Change Response Policy, which I believe all colleagues, you by now you've already gone through, and the National Adaptation Strategy. Furthermore, there is now a national mitigation system composed of sectoral emission targets and carbon budget for major companies. Several baseline documents supporting the development of an effective mitigation and adaptation policies and measures based on scientific analysis have been established. In line with the commitment to cap emissions, South Africa submitted a revised and a bolder nationally determined contribution to align with the global goal of limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Then, colleagues, you will also recall with your engagement with the committee, the department has informed us as the committee that the cabinet has approved the cabinet climate change bill, which is planned for tabling in parliament during the current financial year. Maybe to recap for the benefit of also these other colleagues who have joined us, the purpose of the bill is to build an effective climate change response and ensure the long-term just transition to a climate resilient and lower carbon economy and society. This will be done within the context of sustainable development for South Africa and will provide for all matters related to climate change and give effect of South Africa's international commitment on the climate change response. Then the proposed bill also will seek to provide for a coordinated and integrated response to climate change by all spheres of government, business, and society, and it also enables South Africa to make a fair contribution to the global effort of stabilize greenhouse gas concentration, social and environmental development to proceed in a sustainable manner. It can also be seen that the bill will have a very broad, in that all spheres can already be seen. All spheres of government will be affected and will require cooperation amongst government departments, organized labor, civil society, and business to address climate emergency. Therefore, the contribution from the NGOs and other social actors will play a significant role in processing the climate change bill to ensure that the just transition plans consider realities, fears, and aspirations. So, based on having said that, I will then propose that members at the end, when Advocate Jenkins has presented the legal opinion, then you must guide us on where to channel our energies, given the relatively similar content of the proposed chapter and the upcoming climate change bill. Having said that, I will then hand over to Advocate Jenkins to then present the legal opinion, then we'll allow members to interrogate the legal opinion. Over to you, Advocate Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation to assist myself as well as the committee to understand me enough. If I can share the screen, that would be great. I'm going to try that. Okay. I'm just going to go like that. Okay, thank you. I hope I can. Okay, ma'am. I hope the committee can see this.
Yes, it's
okay,
on
great.
the screen.
Thank you.
You can proceed.
Okay, Thank you. So, ma'am, I'm just going to advise on the procedures concerning this request from the, it's a request from, let me just get my legal opinion here. From the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Centre, ma'am, to have this climate justice charter or climate change justice charter adopted in terms of section 234 of the Constitution. And the background to this, it started in 22 September 2020, where the COPAG, as we want to call them now, sent letters to the Speaker and the Chairperson asking whether they can submit this charter in terms of Section 234. And there was various correspondence, Chairperson, and in terms of that correspondence, they were quite aware that there's no rules in place, and something I will deal with in this presentation. And the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker then advised them to submit the charter for tabling in terms of Section 234, which they then did, and led to the referral this year, 14 October. And the referral itself, ma'am, to the committee is now then, and I want to quote this and want to highlight that section, and the committee is asked by the House then to look at the legal implications of this charter, what will happen if we adopt it, and then to map out an appropriate approach by Parliament, including which structures of the House should be consulted, and that will then lay a basis for the discussion in the Rules Committee and in general, how to deal with Section 234 request to Parliament, ma'am. Hence, the committee sought legal advice on those 4 questions, which I'll deal with specifically in each separately. So it's just whether this climate justice charter is a charter as envisaged in Section 234. What will happen if we adopt it? What is the legal status of a charter once it is adopted? What happens if there's conflict with policies? Is this not an alternative policy making mechanism? And whether the National Assembly rules applies for this particular charter. So, ma'am, I'll deal with each of those at the end of this presentation. First, I want to refer the committee to the regulatory framework against which I considered the legal request from the committee. The Constitution provides for the establishment of a joint rules committee. And that is important to know, which I'll set out later. And I can just say now that this matter is a parliamentary matter, so it involves both houses. It's not legislation that must go from one house to the other. So it can be a joint process or a separate process, each house separately or a joint process. But insofar as it concerns the National Assembly, we know that the Constitution requires the facilitation of public involvement in all processes of the Assembly. And then I quote, for the benefit of the committee, Section 234 of the Constitution. So in order to deepen the culture of democracy, as we'll see earlier, that is one of the substantive issues. That must be the purpose of adopting a charter, to deepen the culture of democracy that's established by the Constitution. Parliament may adopt this consistent with the provisions of the Constitution. So these would be areas which we will evaluate the charter, or that will guide us when the committee wants to adopt a charter. I should do it like this. Ma'am, in terms of the rules, Joint Rule 2, which is referred to in the correspondence to the presiding officers, is that rule that allows the Speaker or the Chairperson or jointly to make rules where there's a vacuum, where there's a lacuna in the rules. And we'll analyze that as well, ma'am, whether that is appropriate to use in this circumstance. Now, the NA rule for the committee allows a committee, such as the Portfolio Committee, to provide for its own or determine its own working arrangements when something is referred to that. So although there are no rules, this committee may adopt a procedure to deal with its business. And then again, there must be public consultation according to the rules as well, which just mirrors what the Constitution is saying. Ma'am, to address the referral, the instructions in the referral, I'm also now pointing or advising the committee on NA Rule 190, which established the NA Rules Committee with a broad mandate, but I've highlighted the relevant parts of their mandates to develop and formulate policy proposals considering the exclusive business of the Assembly, and then to recommend to the Assembly for adoption rules and orders and other policy proposals concerning the business of the Assembly. And the Rules Committee may act on its own initiative or when a matter is referred to it by the House or the Speaker. Ma'am, if we now want to analyze the request and the referral to the committee against this regulatory framework, I think for me, first and foremost, is there must be facilitation of public involvement. Ma'am, when you said in the beginning that the committee must decide how it wants to proceed with this matter, I would say the first step is a decision whether they want to engage public involvement at this point or whether the committee first want to look at the regulatory framework to consider this matter within. In other words, not create a situation where the committee is determining its arrangements by saying, let's have public involvement. Committee may also start by saying this matter should be done in terms of certain rules that must be drafted. So, ma'am, that's the first point. The second point, what will happen if it is adopted, a charter is adopted by Parliament? Ma'am, it will be a parliamentary decision, in my view, and I'll answer the question again when I get to the specific areas. But depending on the nature of the right, some rights will create enforceable obligations against the state, although it's just a policy matter. But, of course, such rights cannot conflict with rights that are afforded within the realm of legislation or the Constitution, because the adoption of the Charter will create what is called soft law. In other words, it would be secondary, it would be even secondary to delegated legislation. It is persuasive force. So it won't have the same status as legislation. So, Chairperson, if I answer the questions individually, which was asked, whether the current Climate Justice Charter before the committee qualifies as one of those rights consistent with the Constitution. The Charter itself, in short, yes. The Constitution makes provision for environmental rights, it makes provision for socio-economic rights, and the Charter addresses all of these in a, as I said in the beginning, in a systemic way. So it's a cross-cutting matter, which the committee needs to take cognizance of, because there might be other portfolio committees who has an interest in this matter, and for that purpose one needs to look at rules and how they can be conferral in matters like this. The second point there is just according to the style. I would advise that if Parliament adopts a charter that I'm going to be biased here, ma'am. Our office deals a lot with drafting. We can draft the charter in the style that Parliament wants. With the same effect, but it would be, importantly to know, it would be a parliamentary charter that's adopted. So Parliament needs to use its own wording in this matter. The second question, ma'am, the legal status of the charter once it's adopted in relation to existing body of policies, which already addresses matters that the charter seeks to address. So as I said before, the charter would be soft law. The rights contained in the charter may be so that it's enforceable against the state, may have persuasive force in a matter that's before a court, etc. But it's only through legislation that one can then limit certain rights of individuals as well as legal persona like companies. So it won't have the same status as legislation. But important to note here, ma'am, there needs to be some kind of consolidation or properly applied system, because one can't have Parliament adopting a specific charter that's contrary to legislation that's out there. So it is a matter of that one needs to consider and balance with what is out there already. The third question, ma'am, whether by adopting this charter, Parliament is not embracing an alternative policy-making approach. The short answer to that, again, is that in terms of Section 234 of the Constitution, Parliament may adopt such rights. So the political processes of policy making behind that is important. But in terms of the Constitution, whatever is adopted in terms of Section 234, it would be a parliamentary decision to give effect to certain constitutional rights, and with the Charter, deepen the democracy or the culture around those democratic rights. So, as I said before, the Charter appears to fit within that realm. But it's just important to remember that the purpose of it would be then to actually unpack certain specific rights that is already assigned or given or recognized or enshrined to certain people. Now, and this is the first I heard of it, ma'am. I haven't been following it well. If there is legislation coming next year, certainly that would be something that needs to be looked at to see what rights are being put out there in terms of the climate change environment. What has just happened at the international conferences in Scotland, and in that light, to make a charter that deepens those rights. What does it mean to deepen democratic rights, ma'am? I would certainly say it makes it more accessible to the general public out there, and that there's a culture, what we used to call mainstreaming of the rights through a document like this. Legislation doesn't quite have that sort of bestseller effect that a charter has, ma'am. The last question, which is of course the interesting part for somebody in my position, because I advise mostly on parliamentary procedures and legislation, whether the National Assembly rules must provide for this charter. Now, ma'am, Joint Rule 2 appears broad enough to allow for the Speaker and the Chairperson to make rules for this. But the long and the short of it is that we've had a discussion before the Constitutional Court when it dealt with Section 89, subsection 1, which is the motion of no confidence in the President. And there should be specific rules in place for that, the Constitutional Court said. So in this regard, analogous to that, ma'am, I would say that this is a position held by our office, not just me, that we should have rules in place to give effect to Section 234. The Constitution has put it there, saying that Parliament has this function, Parliament has this obligation. And for Parliament to have this obligation, to give effect to it, we need to provide rules, either joint rules or in an or through joint rules. Section 234 requires rules to deal with this. Secondly, ma'am, how the committee decides to proceed with it. If the committee decides to proceed with it through an informal process just to get the ball rolling, public participation will be foremost to engage the public in this matter. But I think my advice is clear to the committee. The committee needs to look at this first and foremost through a regulatory framework of the rules. And in this regard, I would suggest that either the chair writes to the speaker to refer this matter for rule, or that the committee consider this as a report to say that this matter cannot be dealt with at this point in time. We need the rules committee to advise whether it should be joint rules or whether it should be separate rules, and what rules should be in there. Because certainly it requires rules for the referral, for the consideration, the public participation process, etc., ma'am. So that, I think, is the total of my input for tonight, ma'am. Thank you, and I am available for further questioning, ma'am. Thank you. I will leave the presentation on for now, if members want to go to certain pages. Otherwise, I will, on instructions, remove it. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Advocate Jenkins. I think you can remove the presentation from the screen so that we can proceed. In the meantime, can I see colleagues who want to ask questions for clarity first before we deliberate on the matter? The presentation is good. I can see your hand, Honorable Speaker. Okay. I was waiting for him to remove his. Yeah, you can proceed now.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to Advocate Jenkins for that advice. Advocate Jenkins, through you, Chair, is this the first sort of charter that's coming through before Parliament. That we have to adopt rules and look at rules and things like that. I would imagine it is the first of its kind, and that's why we don't have rules to deal with this kind of issue. And the thing is, as you said, this is cross-cutting across many departments and government itself, how government operates, and the different levels of government. I mean, it impacts on the executive, it impacts on us as Parliament in how we deal with this matter. So I'm not going to talk about what we should be doing at this moment, but just to ask if it's the first time. And no, I take your advice. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Singh. I think that's your only hand for now. Over to you, Advocate Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am, and thank you, Honorable Singh, for that question. When we were requested to advise on this, the only other example, first, in short, this is the first time Parliament is seized with this request to adopt a charter. In 2006 and 2007, there was a service charter for victims of crime that was a process that went through Cabinet, but that never came to Parliament. There was talk that it will come to Parliament for an adoption in terms of Section 234, but it didn't. So this is the first time, and hence there are no specific rules.
Okay. Colleagues, can I get your views now that there's been clarity? Which route must we follow? Given the clarity, I'm at your mercy, Honorable Singh, followed by Honorable Phillips, in that order.
Yeah, Chairperson, that question having been answered, we work within the parameters of rules. Rules are not something that we can establish just for our portfolio committee. And I think the advice by Advocate Jenkins that, the rules committee or the joint, we should have joint rules for this, because I would think, thinking aloud, that perhaps a joint ad hoc committee needs to look at this matter on behalf of Parliament. And that's, for us, we can comment as a portfolio committee, but we can only comment on the aspects that relate to environment and what we know about the environment. So my suggestion would be that, from the Environment Committee, we can't work outside our scope, and we have limited scope to deal with the entire content of this. But we can at some stage, when we are given an opportunity as a committee to make our comments from an environmental point of view to whichever committee is selected, then we must do that. But for now, I think it would be premature for us to delve into the content of the charter. But also for me to thank this organization, the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, and the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign for bringing this kind of thing. I mean, they've really set a precedence, and I think it's very good that civil society takes an interest in matters of the environment, because it's not only the sole preserve of government and us. The fact that they've taken this initiative is laudable, and we've just got to build on it and just make sure that it complies with the Constitution and the rules of the country. Thank you.
Okay. Honorable Phillips, then followed by Honorable Mbata, that order.
Thanks very much, ma'am. I was just wondering if we're not perhaps putting the cart before the horse. Perhaps what we should do is wait for the bill first and then look at whether the charter would improve and strengthen the bill. And in the meantime, maybe the rules that we need and that Honorable Singh is talking about can actually be drawn up, so that by the time the bill comes through, we'll have the rules to debate the charter. Thank you so much.
Okay. Honorable Mbata.
Chair, I think although we don't have the document from Advocate, but it makes sense, because when he started to, let me open my.
I was about to call you Where are you?
When he started with his presentation, you can see that he mentioned the section of the Constitution which talks about the first one. It's joint rules and orders and joint committees. So it's there in the Constitution, and talks about rule section 59 and 234 of the Constitution, and then it goes then back to the joint rule number 2 of the plenary, and I think he's on track. And when you go back and check, I was taking notes. When you go back and check on the what is it, that the rights in the chapter will not have the same status as legislation. So the charter won't take the legislation space. The legislation will still be there as the legislation that needs to be implemented, but the charter will also assist, like he's saying, it's going to be more accessible to the community, which are the end users, and it's easy when you are mainstreaming it. And also he's speaking about the public participation, and I think at the end he's saying that this will be approved by Parliament. And I think that when you look on our issues and problems that we have, I would say let's go for this charter and see how far do we go with Parliament, because Parliament they have the processes and procedures, and he has mentioned them here. Then they will follow all the procedures, as long as the chairperson can write to Parliament, to the NA, to say this is what we want to explore, especially for our communities. Because I know if it goes for, if it's because if you look, some of the documentation are there, but then of our legislations are there, but they are not the communities, our end users are not, in most cases, familiar with them. And when it comes to implementation, we have a serious problem. And I think this charter will assist us in the implementation, and also will give us a chance to have some interaction with the communities, the end users. Thank you, Chair. That's my intake. I think this is a brilliant idea, and we can't say let's shift it and put it aside. It's very important. Thank you.
Okay. I hear the various views. Advocate Jenkins, are you able to help us reconcile all these views?
I can do my best, ma'am.
Try. That will be our way forward. Yes.
Ma'am, I'm not sure what the time limits or the time frames for the committee is to report on this matter. But I think the committee, from what I'm hearing, would like the staff, including myself, to draft a report for the committee to say that the committee has received this reference. This was the mandate given by the House with the referral, and the committee is of the view that this is a cross-cutting matter. That the committee is of the view that, seeing that there are no rules, that there should be given consideration to have joint rules in place. I hear a preference for that, and I think that would be the best. And yes, that that this matter should be referred to the joint rules to make rules for the implementation of Section 234. And I think one can leave it at that. The issue of the climate change bill that's coming, I think that will then come to the committee when it comes. My experience in Parliament is you sometimes have a program that says it comes in January or February, and then it comes in June or August, for whatever reason. But I think the committee should deal with what it can deal with, which is a report on this matter, and then let the joint rules be drafted that will give effect to it, and then the committee can take this matter and push it through the process established there. So I think we should draft a report for the committee, and I'm not sure when the committee would want that by. That's my proposal, man.
I think you have reconciled it in the best way. Colleagues, is it not the best way to conclude this matter as he has reconciled the matter? To say that we'll note this and then say these matters are cross-cutting, and then there are no rules in place, then this matter should be referred to the Joint Rules Committee. That's how it is. Can we conclude it in that way? Then we'll be able to provide that report to the speaker. Can I get a mover and a seconder of that proposal? Honorable Mbata.
I move for the proposal to be taken chair as how the learned advocate has put it. Thank you.
Honorable Sistembeka.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. I second the proposal as advocate is advising. I think it's a correct one. Thank you, Chair.
At least the matter that concludes that matter, and we can excuse Advocate Jenkins. Thank you so much for that, Advocate Jenkins. Thank you for always availing yourself whenever we need you. We need your services. It's much appreciated.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse you. You can go and attend to other matters. Then let's come to the agenda item, and then the presentation has been shared, the one that Advocate has just presented, colleagues, for your further reading. And yeah, so Chileka has distributed that to you now. Then, having said that, then I should think, then let me welcome our delegation. Maybe let me start to welcome, as I've indicated, there was apologies for Minister Chrissy, Deputy Minister Chochu, and the DG, but like I've indicated, we have the DDG Vanessa Benderman here, the DDG Regulatory Compliance and Sector Monitoring. She's in our midst. And then then there's also Mr. Peter Lake, who's the acting DDG Climate Change, who's also the delegation. The delegation head is G Benderman. And then we also have Ms. Judy Bioment, who's the DDG for Oceans and Coast. And then Mr. Toura Moro, who's the Chief Director, Policy Advisor. I'm raising that so that the colleagues from the Center for Environmental Rights shouldn't think that the department is not represented. And then also there's a lot of directors and chief directors who are in our midst, as and when, if there are issues that we would like to clarify or allow them to comment, you'll know who's here. Then they meet staff from the ministry, as I've indicated, also the staff from the DG's office. And then I should think, then let me welcome the delegation for the Center for Environmental Rights, led by its director, Ms. Melissa Fori. We want to also welcome you, Advocate Abidno. Also welcome you, Ms. Nicole Loza and Ms. Gabriela Not, including Mr. Paul Lado. You are all welcome. And then without wasting much time, I think we should then allow you to brief us as the Center on Environmental Rights on Climate Governance. Over to you, dear colleagues. You are welcome. We don't underestimate the critical role that you do towards the sector. Can I hand over to you, Ms. Fori?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening.
Oh, it's not Ms. Fori who's leading. Okay.
Chair, I think Ms. Fori she was on the call earlier. I see she's
Okay.
off. But good evening and
fine,
thank you for this opportunity, Madam Chair and honourable members and colleagues in the room.
Proceed.
I seem to be having bandwidth issues. I'm just going to turn my camera off.
No, it's fine. You can proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We thank you for this opportunity to address the committee at this critical time in the climate crisis and how the world is responding. As you said, my name is Brandon Abdenor, and I'm a climate advocacy lawyer at the Centre. And Madam Chair, I think you introduced the Centre very well earlier on, so I'm not going to repeat that. Honourable members, we've been working in the space of climate law and policy for a number of years and have been conducting, among other things, ongoing research into climate governance mechanisms around the world, and would like to take this opportunity to share some of these key best practice principles that have emerged from this research. Due to our ongoing work in the field of climate change and the law, we also offer this presentation as a form of map that both affect and are impacted by the climate crisis. The way we are heading, by the end of the century, many regions in the world will be uninhabitable due to direct heat, desertification or flooding as climate change intensifies. We face water scarcity, high temperatures, the collapse of ecosystems, and increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events and fires. We can also expect to see indirect health and social impacts arising from food insecurity, mass migrations, high living costs, and conflict, as the world as we know it undergoes dramatic changes. According to South Africa's own climate policy, we have to urgently strengthen the resilience of our society and economy to such climate change impacts, and to develop and implement policies, measures, mechanisms, and infrastructure that protect the most vulnerable. The burden of resolving these issues is unfairly placed on the shoulders of our young people and future generations, and they are going to have to navigate a very different and difficult world as a result of our choices and our poor governance or our good governance in terms of mitigating the effects of the climate crisis. The decisions that are made now will have an irreversible impact on our climate and the future of a habitable planet. In many respects, as you'll see later, we have fewer than 10 short years to meet this target. It will not be possible to save our climate and preserve a livable planet without drastically reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, and this requires drastic reduction of fossil fuel consumption. South Africa, however, is committed in many respects to increased exploitation of fossil fuels, and this is not compatible with a solid climate crisis response. Although climate science is quite complex, the fundamental principles of climate change for our purposes are relatively simple. A number of human activities are causing excessive amounts of greenhouse gases to be released into the atmosphere, causing what we call the greenhouse effect to be unnaturally strengthened. So in other words, we're insulating the planet more than we should be, which is leading to global warming. These greenhouse gases, the main ones that we are concerned with, are carbon dioxide. And you can see from this graph that the bulk of that comes from burning fossil fuels and industrial processes. A certain portion in green there also comes from forestry and other land uses. This is where ecosystems get destroyed and can no longer function as carbon sinks or stores of carbon. Then the next most prevalent greenhouse gas is methane. And a lot of this arises from industrial processes as well as agriculture, and also gets emitted by leakage of methane gas from the gas value chain. And then the third most prevalent one is nitrous oxide, and most of that arises from agriculture. If we look at the graphs on the right, the top graph with the red line is carbon dioxide going back 800,000 years, and you can see with a bit of fluctuation it's more or less been steady. And as we started burning fossil fuels around the 1850s, we can see those concentrations going up. And it's very similar for methane in the second graph. Here we can see the direct link between carbon dioxide emissions and global temperature. Again, this graph started going up as we started burning coal about 170 years ago. And this heating in turn disrupts the climate system in a number of different ways, leading to the impacts and risks that we are speaking about today. So although climate change is an environmental issue on the face of it, it's also a social issue, an economic issue, a health and safety issue, an energy issue, an infrastructure and human settlements issue, a food and water security issue, and more. The climate crisis is a crisis with far-reaching implications for the full spectrum of human rights in our constitution, and these are rights which all spheres of government are obliged to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill. Notwithstanding this, though, the primary responsibility for managing South Africa's climate change response resides with the Minister and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment at an executive level, and significantly with this portfolio committee at a political and legislative level. How this responsibility is exercised will play a powerful role in determining whether the mounting pressure leads to disaster or is seized as the opportunity for socio-economic transformation that it can be. Honourable members, in our view, it's not unreasonable to say that we've entered a new era of climate crisis response. In October of this year, President Ramaphosa said, and I quote, "It's no exaggeration to say that the world is facing a climate crisis of unprecedented proportions. Climate change presents serious health, environmental, and economic risks for our country. All these emerging trends mean that we need to act with urgency and ambition to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and undertake a transition to a low-carbon economy. Many of our peer countries have already started migrating to low-carbon economic dispensations." End quote. Honourable members, a number of events have taken place recently which give us an indication of the trends and imperatives that we face. Firstly, in August of this year, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released the first part of its sixth assessment report. This report addresses the latest findings from around the world on the physical science basis of climate change, and unfortunately the report confirms that the climate crisis is more severe than has been found up to now. Secondly, we have just seen the conclusion of the COP26 Climate Summit held in the UK, and the Glasgow Climate Pact that was agreed to clearly lays out a pathway for accelerated climate change mitigation and accountability measures. While the Paris Agreement calls for signatory nations to submit nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, every 5 years, and we have just submitted an updated NDC for this year's COP, the negotiations in Glasgow saw nations being requested to submit stricter targets by the end of next year already. So we can see that the pace is picking up. What also became apparent at the COP is that the $100 billion a year that developed nations had pledged to pay to support developing nations with climate aid has not been forthcoming and may not be seen for at least another 2 years. We fully support the concept of climate justice, which includes wealthy nations who have historically emitted high levels of greenhouse gas, in providing financial aid to support developing nations in their climate efforts. And this is sometimes called the climate debt. Given the signals that we've seen at COP26, though, we have to accept that the scale and the time frame for such climate aid are open questions, and we cannot afford to take a blanket approach that we will not address the climate crisis until such aid is available. As much as the developed world owes South Africa and others the climate debt, we in turn owe such debt to the rest of Africa, for instance, being responsible for a third of the continent's emissions. Furthermore, whether or not South Africa accesses financial support for its climate response, there remains a positive obligation and constitutional imperative on government to take adequate steps to ensure that the people of South Africa are not exposed to the worst effects of the climate crisis. Thirdly, South Africa has been offered a first of its kind climate finance deal in the amount of 130 billion rand. While the details of this deal are still to be worked out and then fully evaluated, This is in all likelihood a promising first step in what will hopefully be an ongoing series of financial support mechanisms from the developed world. And this finance is different from the $100 billion that I spoke about. However, such financing deals come with conditions related to accelerated decarbonization. And as a country, we are going to have to continue demonstrating increased commitment and actions to decarbonize. One of the reasons we were considered eligible for such a deal is that the costs of decarbonizing our economy are relatively low compared with other countries. But competition is fierce, and countries like Mexico, Indonesia, and Vietnam are also vying for these opportunities. So if we do not continue to exhibit strong commitment to climate mitigation action, we may well lose our attractiveness as a destination for such financing. The scientific community has overwhelmingly and repeatedly warned that to avert major climate change risks and impacts, all efforts should be made to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This has been affirmed by the IPCC in its 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And this report states unequivocally that in order to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees, greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030. And that's over 2010 levels. So when I said earlier that we've got less than 10 years, this is a large part of what I meant. Over and above that, we need to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we know that Southern Africa is warming at twice the rate as the average for the rest of the globe. Still from that IPCC report, in terms of physical risk, the scientific community is more certain than ever before about the impacts of global warming, the links between greenhouse gas emissions and warming, the severity and timescales of these impacts. And some of the key findings from that report that relate to South and Southern Africa include, under all scenarios, South Africa is going to experience increasing heat waves and extreme hot weather events. Southern Africa is one of the relatively few regions globally that is going to experience a decrease in mean average rainfall and an increase in droughts as a result of global warming, and soil moisture levels are going to decrease. So although we will have less rain overall, when it does rain, the rainfall events are going to be more violent and more severe, and this aggravates flooding risk. There is new and increased risk of tropical storm impacts for the northern KZN coast and the Limpopo Valley. And sea level rise is going to be at least 60 centimeters by the end of the century. So not our most immediate problem, but if you think of the settlements at the coast and the infrastructure down there, it is potentially a very significant problem. In a recently released report by Professor Nicholas King called Climate Change Implications for South Africa's Youth, the report provides an expert interpretation of a number of recent specialist reports on climate change as regards impacts on lives, livelihoods, and lifestyles from 2021 onwards through 2030, 2040, and beyond, with a particular focus on today's and tomorrow's youth. The report describes the following risks and effects which will intensify in the coming decades. So there's a focus on fresh water, which is already a scarce resource in South Africa, and climate change exacerbates these limitations. For future generations, increasing conflict over scarce water will almost certainly arise, and conflict will also very likely arise with neighboring countries over shared river basin resources and diminishing supplies. Water infrastructure is likely to get damaged, affecting quality and precipitating disease outbreaks. And together with rising temperatures and drought conditions, it's virtually certain that these events will collapse crop production, kill livestock, and greatly exacerbate food insecurity. Girls and women who traditionally are tasked with fetching water for their families will spend more time sourcing and fetching water, with all the attendant negatives associated, such as missing schooling for girls, insecurity, and risks of violence. The report also looks at food security. Rising temperatures induced prolonged drought will lead to reduced levels of soil moisture, reducing plant growing days, and that combines with heat stress, making agricultural labor untenable. And this will negatively impact the full spectrum of the agricultural sector, leading to declines in rural incomes. Temperatures also enable greater pest and disease productivity, and outbreaks on crops, livestock, and wildlife will almost certainly increase. In terms of fire, South Africa has already and will almost certainly experience rapidly increased probability of fire risk conditions in most areas, and increased penetration in areas not normally associated with fires, such as the forests of the East Coast and interior mountain ranges. Informal settlements will be particularly vulnerable to increasing fire risk, destroying dwellings and livelihoods, and potentially killing people. In terms of infrastructure, public infrastructure such as roads, water and sanitation, health, education, and electricity services will very likely be continuously damaged by extreme events, becoming increasingly costly and unaffordable to repair and replace. This in turn impacts on service delivery, which will almost certainly decline. Disaster relief will be increasingly overstretched and unable to reach most people. Private infrastructure such as houses, businesses, and farm buildings are likely to be damaged, destroying livelihoods, and insurance costs will rise, becoming unaffordable for many. The coasts and oceans will also be impacted as temperature increases occur, and these will shift ranges and affect livelihoods of those who depend on the oceans directly for food and income. Emotional well-being and climate-induced migration. So many people will likely lose their sense of place and identity through dramatic changes in their surroundings, the breakdown of social ties and cultural connections as they are forced to move to try and survive and access services such as healthcare, education, and social grants. Informal settlements will expand dramatically, including with in-migration from countries to the north as climate change impacts compromise livelihoods across the region, with conflicts and xenophobia leading to violence. For less developed countries such as South Africa, with already constrained fiscal resources, disaster response relief work and rebuilding will very likely overwhelm the state's ability to respond adequately, compromising every aspect of future service delivery and socioeconomic well-being. For an example of just how costly addressing climate impacts is, the drought relief allocations for the past 5 years totaled 990 million rand, and that is just one of the costs related to dealing with climate impacts. Honorable members, we then have the economic risks. So goods and services created using fossil fuel energy are going to have a high carbon footprint due to the direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. And this means exposure to increased taxes and other costs. The European Union has already introduced the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will levy a fee on all imports based on their carbon footprint. So an extensive fossil fuel powered electricity system, such as ours currently is, will ensure that our exporters are heavily penalized and their competitiveness is at risk. As laws continue to get applied more vigorously, and as policies, targets, and financial pressures become more restrictive, we see the very real risk that fossil fuel infrastructure and developments will become unviable and illegal to operate long before the end of their economic lifespan. And this results in what we know as stranded assets, where the owners never realized the profits that were counted on, and very likely placing the burden on the public purse in terms of decommissioning and management costs. We've already spoken about the climate financing that's available, and if we don't send out the right signals in terms of addressing climate change, we lose our attractiveness to be eligible for that financing. We also stand the reputational risk, whereby South Africa could be seen as a reckless and unnecessarily intensive carbon emitter, compromising investment opportunities and depriving the economy of growth opportunities. And then as more stakeholders align with the imperatives of halting global warming, litigation risk increases. More than 1,000 climate litigation cases have been launched around the world between 2015 and 2020. And our courts have already recognized that new coal-fired power developments are contrary to climate change imperatives. So what do we need to do, honorable members? We can see that the climate crisis is broad and deep, both in terms of risks and impacts, as well as solutions and responses. So generally, responses are classified as either mitigation or adaptation. Mitigation fundamentally means slowing down, halting, and then ideally reversing global warming by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Nearly all human activities and developments have a carbon footprint, whether direct or indirect, and all of these carbon footprints need to be reduced and ultimately eliminated. The big immediate focus for South Africa needs to be decarbonizing the energy system, which is responsible for close on 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions, depending on how it's measured. Industrial processes, transport, agriculture, and waste are other relatively high emission sectors that will also need to address mitigation. Emissions reductions are managed via setting targets and trajectories to reduce emissions in a progressive manner. The Paris Agreement stipulates that each nation will set and submit nationally determined contributions, which are greenhouse gas emissions limits that a country aims not to exceed. South Africa formulated an updated NDC in the past few months, and this is expressed as a range of between 350 and 420 megatons of CO2 equivalent per annum by 2030. By comparison, South Africa's current emissions are around 450 to 470 megatons per annum. South Africa is the 13th highest emitter in the world and responsible for around 1.3% of global emissions. If all other factors were equal, that would mean that we would need to contribute to 1.3% of emissions reductions required. However, due to this climate debt that I spoke of earlier, owed by developed countries, there is a fair argument to be made that a developing nation like South Africa should be permitted a more equitable comparative reduction trajectory, given its developmental needs. Based on this thinking, there are various models available which calculate a so-called fair share, taking these developmental needs, historical emissions, and capacity to decarbonize into account. One such model is the Climate Equity Reference Calculator, which allocates to South Africa a decarbonization fair share of between 0.46 and 0.7%. So you can see how that adjustment is made down from the 1.3. Based on this calculation, South Africa's updated NDC upper range is only just compatible with 2 degrees of warming, and the lower range is just within the 1.5 degree warming range. According to the globally renowned Climate Action Tracker, South Africa's NDC is rated as insufficient and on track to contribute to in excess of 2 degrees of warming. The government should be commended, however, in that this is an improvement, as our last NDC was rated as highly insufficient, which leads to a warming of over 3 degrees. So as we can see again, the pressure to strengthen these targets is going to continue increasing. The other type of climate change response is adaptation, and that refers to policies and measures that need to be taken to adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already happening or are unavoidable. We can see from the physical risks that I spoke of earlier that we have to bring all efforts to bear on adapting and creating a climate resilient society and economy. A selection of examples includes protecting informal and other vulnerable settlements from flooding, landslides, fires, ensuring food security with the knowledge that important sources such as maize and livestock are facing an existential threat, managing water supplies in the face of increasing drought and freshwater scarcity, managing climate migration as people move away from heavily climate change impacted regions, and managing peace and security as environmental pressures create conflict conditions. In terms of current regulation in South Africa,
colleagues, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
We can hear you, but not the presenter.
No, they speak. The presenter has disappeared. I thought it was my network.
Let me call him, Chair.
Okay, I thought it was my network. Amongst the other colleagues that are here, seems it's only him. I thought one of the team members can be proceeding, but it doesn't look like. You'll have to wait.
Sorry, Chair, my name is Nicole Loza. I'm an attorney at the Centre for Environmental Rights. I'm happy to proceed if Brandon isn't able to join. Although I would prefer to wait a minute or two if that's all right. Given that Brandon's done the preparation work for the presentation, I would also just need to get quickly a copy of the presentation to share the screen. So if you'll give me a minute. Thank you.
Chileka, can you give it the sharing rights so that if he's not coming, because we cannot just wait indefinitely. The members have been very busy the whole day. Nicole, that's the issue here. At some point, the members need to rest. So she will give you the sharing rights, then he can assist in responding to questions that members might have. Chileka, can we get that done, Carla? Can you get that done so that Nicole can proceed in the meantime? You've been assigned.
Okay.
Yeah. Nicole?
I'll fly the slides just now.
Yeah. You remember where it got frozen, eh? We'll assist. Okay, Nicole.
All right. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to catch up with where we were. I think my colleague Brandon was just talking about the current measures in place to regulate. There we were, to regulate climate change in South Africa. So at present, what we really have is a regime in terms of international law. South Africa is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which is essentially the international treaty regulating climate change on an international scale. And as a signatory and having ratified the Paris Agreement, South Africa has committed to essentially pursue best efforts to limit temperatures globally on average to below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally and essentially below 1.5 degrees Celsius, knowing that is essentially the tipping point for a safe climate, as Brandon has already said. And under the Paris Agreement, we're obliged to submit nationally determined contributions every five 5 years. And as you have already pointed out, Madam Chair, South Africa has just updated its nationally determined contribution now, shortly before the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. So in terms of domestic legislation, we don't. This is essentially where the problem lies. We don't have overarching climate change legislation as such. We of course have a constitution which recognizes and affords protection to a number of fundamental human rights under the Bill of Rights, including the right to an environment not harmful to health and well-being, and to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations. Arguably, there's quite a broad scope there to include a constitutional imperative to protect the people of South Africa against the, if I may say, existential harms that are posed by the climate crisis. And then, of course, we have our National Environmental Management Act, which also imposes broad obligations to implement measures to avoid essentially degradation and pollution of the environment, which broadly interpreted also includes climate change. But nothing specifically dealing with climate change. And then under the Air Quality Act, we have regulations that require annual reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we also have, under the Air Quality Act, regulations that deal with essentially obligations on emitters that exceed certain thresholds. They have to submit pollution prevention plans, which are essentially voluntary plans which set out how they plan to reduce their emissions. But what we don't have are enforceable greenhouse gas emission limits or standards. And certainly, as has been made very clear by this presentation so far, climate change is a much bigger, broader issue, and can't really be confined to air quality and emissions. So what we really do need is broader legislation and enforceable regulations that can properly and adequately address the issue of climate change. It's not really appropriate that it sits currently within the narrow confines of the Air Quality Act, and what we also desperately need are enforceable greenhouse gas emission reduction obligations. I think my colleague Brandon has rejoined. So Brandon, do you just want to continue speaking, and I'll move the slides for you?
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I had obviously technical issues there. So yeah, as Nicole was saying, we are happy to be able to move beyond just what NEMA and the Air Quality Act says, and to have a climate change bill, as you introduced, Madam Chair. And we welcome this new draft of the bill. We urgently need this legislation as a starting point to set out more detailed obligations of government to implement mitigation and adaptation measures, and to provide the legislative basis for regulating emissions reductions within greenhouse gas emitting sectors and by companies. Currently, there are no direct greenhouse gas emissions limits prescribed by law. So specific, adequate and overarching climate change legislation will go a long way to provide the necessary legal certainty and a clearer path for climate action in South Africa. We would like to outline some of the key governance principles that have come up in our research. Nicole, there you've got it, thank you. So the first one is collaboration and cooperation. We can see from how the mitigation and adaptation needs reach into every sector, every activity, and every geographic area of society, and how we are facing a monumental task that will touch every life and endeavor. It's probably safe to say that the state might never have faced such an urgent and far-reaching need to respond effectively and efficiently. Now, there's no way that the DFFE is going to manage the full spectrum of the response on its own. And even the climate change bill devolves responsibility onto a wide range of state departments and SOEs, as well as provincial and local government structures. It is globally recognized that ensuring that effective cooperative governance around climate matters is one of the biggest challenges to ensuring a good response, and that a siloed approach hampers efforts, wastes time, and dilutes effectiveness. So a challenge for the DFFE and for this committee, Madam Chair, is how to ensure seamless cooperation with other entities and agencies. We need to avoid a situation where climate crisis response is seen as the sole preserve of the environmentally mandated state bodies, who are then persuading and policing other relevant role players. Climate change response needs to be adequately mainstreamed and centered within all relevant departments and agencies, and become a key performance area in each. While this can be catered for as best as possible in the legislation, its success also depends heavily on the attitude and approach of those to whom the responsibility has primarily been entrusted. The level of constructive collaboration needs to extend beyond the intragovernmental, however. The business sector, financial sector, labor movement, traditional leadership structures, civil society, academia, and other role players all need to play an important role in making the transition to a decarbonized economy and climate resilient society. In order to facilitate and enable this level of collaboration and effort by this broad range of role players, it is critically important that relevant information is made easily and publicly available. Climate change affects everyone, and access to information allows people, communities, a range of different state actors, businesses, and others to understand what is happening and plan for effective responses. According to the World Bank Reference Guide to Climate Change Framework Legislation, which was released in December last year, accessible information can, and I quote, support independent expert advice, coordination, stakeholder engagement, and oversight. It can also serve a broader developmental purpose. It can contribute to independent research, raise awareness, and facilitate debate on climate change policy. And the data can help businesses assess markets and identify investment opportunities. Information concerning greenhouse gas emissions and their management affects all of us and must be publicly accessible. Peru's climate law has detailed provisions on access to information. Its law states at the outset that there is a principle of transparency and that the state has a duty to make available all public information related to climate change, respecting the right of every person to access adequate and timely information without the need to invoke justification or interest that motivates such requirement. In Guatemala, most of the country's climate change information can be found online on a government website, as all public and private entities are legally required to provide information directly related to climate change. There's no reason why the records under the Climate Change Bill cannot be made publicly available, particularly given the public interest in this information. Honorable members, along with other civil society organizations, we have had extensive experience of not being able to access information of this nature. This usually results in having to submit a PIA application and occasionally even litigate in this regard. Ultimately, the sought after information is accessed, although often at considerable cost and with delays. And this is not only a drain on resources for all parties, it creates an atmosphere of mistrust and antagonism, none of which serve the interests of responding to a crisis of this nature. The public must have access to detailed facility-level reporting, transparent auditing and verification of data, and public access to greenhouse gas emission data. It is also important to have access to sectoral emissions targets, carbon budgets, and any exemptions to any carbon budgets, as well as adaptation and mitigation plans. Again, due to the impact that climate change has on everyone, it is essential that there's adequate and meaningful public participation in all key administrative decision-making processes in matters relating to climate change. In terms of monitoring and oversight, the need for easily accessible information will also support effective monitoring and oversight. Because there are so many role players, it is critically important that the DFFE and this committee in its oversight role is able to effectively evaluate compliance with climate change response mechanisms. Climate impact assessments and strategic assessment approach. According to the IPCC 6th assessment report, humanity can only emit another 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent if we are to have an 83% chance of limiting warming to 1.5. If we are happy to accept a 2-degree warming limit, this goes up to 900 gigatons. By comparison, humanity has already emitted around 2,400 gigatons since 1850, and this reality shows us that there's a very real hard limit as to how much more we can emit. Therefore, essential that development planning takes place in a central and strategic manner with reference to the remaining global carbon budget, which can obviously be prorated to ascertain a South African emissions allowance. Currently, what we have is it's only effectively mandatory for certain listed activities subject to an EIA process to undergo a climate impact assessment. And while this can be effective at project level, there is currently no known system in place to evaluate the carbon footprint of development as a whole. And this can lead us into a dangerous knowledge and information gap, which potentially sets the scene for an uncoordinated pathway into excessive emissions. And honorable members, also essential are strict targets and enforcements. So emission reductions pathways and emission limits are possibly the most important tool in ensuring it is therefore critically important that the disturbing truth is that ever since the global scientific community has been studying global climate change, the results continuously seem to become more alarming or more severe as our understanding increases. So the NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, are supposedly rooted in science, and but they're also a political decision that's taken by cabinet, and obviously cabinet needs to exercise a balancing function. So it is conceivable that any given NDC might become outdated when the latest and best available science is consulted. It is therefore important for the legislature and executive to ensure that it has access to the latest science and make strategic decisions in light of this. Emitters who exceed emissions reductions targets, particularly if they do so habitually or excessively, are committing a wrong against the rest of society. It is unlikely that they will or even be able to make reparations or pay compensation for damages suffered, given the nature of the damages. So it's therefore imperative that transgressors are strictly policed and held accountable by a tight regulation. Okay, thanks, Nicole. We can move to red flags. So as a result of the climate change work that we do, we are familiar with a number of dynamics or trends or concepts that pose challenges to effective and efficient climate change response. And we just want to alert the committee to some of those. The first of these is that in the context of climate change, there is no such thing as clean coal. The burning of coal is our single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions and also our best opportunity to decarbonize. In a report that's been made available by expert Dr. Ron Sahu, it clearly demonstrates how even the latest and supposedly most clean technologies do not mitigate the climate harms of burning coal. Secondly, further coal-fired power infrastructure is climate harming, technologically unnecessary, and unnecessarily expensive. And it also has a more detrimental effect on employment numbers than some of the alternatives. According to a report by the Energy Systems Research Group from UCT, new coal-fired power plants would cost the economy some 23 billion rand more than alternative options. Then the use of fossil gas, which is sometimes also called natural gas, is often presented as being a necessary transitional energy source and is claimed to be less harmful to the environment than burning coal. While burning gas does have lower greenhouse gas emissions than burning coal, the methane that leaks from the supply chain cancels out any benefits over coal and gives rise to economic and climate risk and harm in the same way that burning coal does. And then, honorable members, we come to this concept of net zero. Remember, we spoke of net zero by 2050 being one of the essential conditions for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. However, in the definition of net zero, there is room for the possibility of carbon dioxide removal. So in other words, taking some of these greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere again. And the idea there is that we could conceivably remove as much as we are emitting. However, this technology to do does not exist at any meaningful scale as far as climate mitigation is concerned. And there's no one that is able to guarantee that it will be able to do so in the foreseeable future. And the problem here is that net zero as a concept gets abused by emitters who don't want to reduce emissions and are counting on the emissions being able to be removed at some point in the future. But until such time as this removal is technologically possible or feasible, net zero should actually be thought of as actual zero. So in other words, we should still be aiming to reduce emissions in real terms. Okay, Nicole, next slide. Honorable members, there are also green flags. So decarbonization will result in a number of co-benefits, such as drastically reducing air and water pollution and reducing water use, in turn improving human health and food security. And electricity could conceivably end up on a more affordable pathway as well. The transition to a decarbonized society potentially has enormous economic benefits and job creation potential. There are many doing studies in this field, but it's generally accepted that the employment or jobs multiplier for renewable energy is far higher than the fossil fuel system. And then effective adaptation has the potential to improve local service delivery and ensure that vulnerable communities and groupings are having their needs met. So in other words, a climate resilient society is in all likelihood going to be a more socially and economically just one. So the pressure to take action, which I've referred to a number of times, I wish to highlight where this pressure comes from. Sometimes an argument gets made that we are being dictated to by the developed world for its benefit. But the world has moved fast in terms of climate crisis awareness and actions and strategies taken. So beyond the United Nations and its member countries, we're seeing pressure to respond brought to bear by investors, trading partners, financiers and insurers, regulators, the business community, civil society, consumers, and voters. Every day, more parties are realizing that an effective climate crisis response is a matter of survival and not an optional nice to have. In recent years, there's been a global surge in litigation brought by citizens and NGOs against governments for failing to take adequate action. And governments around the world are increasingly being called to account for their lack of ambition and sufficient action on the climate crisis. South Africa, as a country with strong constitutional foundations, undisputedly requires government to protect the people of South Africa from the harmful effects of greenhouse gas emissions contributing to the climate crisis. Okay, that's the last one, Nicole. Thanks. Honourable members, we hope we've shed some light on the complexity and urgency of the climate crisis, and have also hopefully highlighted why the DFFE and this committee have an enormous and unique responsibility in ensuring the safety and well-being of all in South Africa. We have forwarded a copy of our talking points to Teleka, which includes links to all the reports and findings mentioned during the presentations, and we would also be more than happy to have discussions with members on any of these or related issues. We thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you so much. Colleagues, that's the presentation. Can I see a show of hands of the colleagues who want to interact with the presentation? Show of hands, dear colleagues. Honorable Weber sent up, followed by Honorable Singh. Thus far, those are the two ends. Then I'll notice the others as we progress. And then, oh, Peter, you want to comment as well? It's okay. Maybe let me allow Peter from the department to comment first, then we'll allow Honorable Singh. Peter, Mr. Lecky.
Thank you so much, Chair. First of all, could I just compliment the CER on an excellent presentation? It would be very, very difficult to fault what they put forward. It's all completely consistent with the way things are, and it's completely consistent with the international science. There's just one thing I'd like to add, though, Honourable Chair and Honourable Members, is one of the things in terms of this sort of situation and responding to climate change is not just around law. It's around voluntary change. And Chair, if I can draw on your initial opening statements and around this is everybody's responsibility, that we all have to work together. And just to bring to your attention that in terms of the Human Sciences Research Council's Climate Change Awareness Survey for last year, they found that the South African levels of climate awareness are exceptionally poor. Which is a huge problem if, for example, we're looking for voluntary behavior change. So typically, for example, only 9% of South Africans see climate change as the top national environmental concern. And that hasn't changed since that survey was done in 2010. So, and 16% of South Africans believe that the world's climate is not changing. And so we refer to these as trend skeptics. But furthermore, 28% believe that climate has been changing, but is not due to human processes. And so we regard these as attribution skeptics. And if one adds them together, it's an almost, it's a shocking figure of around 44% of South Africans would be regarded as climate change denialists. And so if we, in this sort of situation where we have such a high level of denial by South Africans, it becomes incredibly difficult to make the dramatic changes that the CER has been talking to, and we all realize we have to involve ourselves in. And I think there's a unique role for civil society and NGOs to play a massive role in building this level of public awareness. Because as you know, government is not great at this sort of situation because we're often accused of propaganda and so on and so forth. So there's a big gap in our strategy around building up this momentum around this massive transition to a low carbon economy and society that involves basically making sure that all South Africans are on board as well. So that's just one comment that I wanted to add, Chair, and thank you very much for that opportunity.
You're more than welcome, Peter. Then I will allow Honorable Weber, followed by Honorable Singh in that order.
Thank you, Chair. Peter actually just jumped to me. I didn't want to say the mouthful he just said, but I would have loved to have had this presentation in the beginning of my term in 2019. It would have jump-started quite a lot of things that I didn't know. I'm not like Honorable Singh that has been here for 10 years in environment, that's all expert. So I do want to compliment and say thank you to the Centre of Environmental Rights that actually came to this. But I understand everything and I work through everything, and I actually come from Mpumalanga where most of the stuff we talk about is probably high up in Mpumalanga. And one of our biggest issues is the power stations, of which 12 of the fossil fuel power stations is in Mpumalanga, and then one of the Sasol's, and just bordering to Gauteng, and Free State is the other Sasolburg. So here's my question. A lot of coal mines is there, a lot of power stations is there, and I agree with actually Mr. Luki about the fact that awareness is not there. It is still shocking to me that I run into people and they don't know about climate change, or you run into people and they say straight to you, I don't believe it is a fulfill. But my only question is, can I maybe request, I know in the process don't work like that, but maybe our Honourable Chair can help with that the Department's water, which is very, very serious, and the Department of Mineral Resources also see this presentation. I think that will help a lot, because I know the three of us need to get actually together and start working together on these issues. because individually we can't. So I know from our side we have to do that. I don't know what's the process, Chair, but if there's a possibility that mineral resources and water, Department of Water can also see this presentation, that we sort of have the same baseline, if you want to call it that. Thank you again, CEO.
Thank you, dear colleague. Can I hand over to Honorable Singh, who's going to be followed by Honorable Mbata, and then it will be Honorable Paulson, then it will be Honorable Phillips, and then Honorable Tembeka, MCHUNU.
I see you're learning now. You're learning, but you learned it. Honorable Chair, I'm sorry I'll have to leave soon after because I need to get to buy some food before 9 o'clock. Otherwise, I won't eat tonight. No. All I can say is just echo the sentiments of Honorable Weber and what Peter said as well, and compliment the drafters of this document. I mean, they've educated us further in terms of what climate change means, its consequences, etc. And I think what's left for us, it's going to require multilateral, multi-departmental, multi-government, civil society approach to see how we can get to the real, issues at hand and how we mitigate all the risks that are associated with it. And all I can say for now is just, to thank them and say that we must take on board these issues. And I just hope that when the climate change, the bill comes in force and there's public, inputs and all that, they will still come in and make lots of inputs to that, because that will enhance and enrich that process in terms of having legislation, but whether it can be implemented or not is something that we'll have to see moving forward. So I just want to thank them for the presentation. And say
thank you.
To really take it.
Thank you, dear colleagues, and the excused. Thank you so much for that valuable input. Then, who's next? It's Honorable Mbata. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to thank the presenters on this presentation. Really, we are in trouble when we are number one in the whole world on climate change, that we are not complying. It means that we still have a lot to do. Because you look at our industries, we've got lots of industries, and some of them are not complying, some of them are complying, and we still have ESCOM, which deals with using coals to generate energy. But I think we need to sit down and check how best can we deal with this thing. Because if you look at the industries where, especially ESCOM, where there are plants that deal with coal to generate energy, there's a lot of people that are employed there. What's going to happen to them? I think we need to start planning on the other phase. Let me say phase 2. How best can we deal with those people? Because South Africa, we have a problem of the high unemployment rate. And if you close all those plants, then those people will be jobless. And yet we are suffering now when it comes to the unemployment rate. But also, I always say we need to benchmark with other countries on how best did they deal with these issues in order for them to have a clean environment to comply according to the climate change, because really we still have waste that is piling in our landfill sites, of which those landfill sites, they are almost full. And most of that waste can be used to generate energy. But it's not happening at the moment. And if it's happening, we don't know. It's only one company that will do that. But all of a sudden, that company vanished. So it means that there is no support, because I feel that in order for us to comply, we need to slowly move away from these things, the fossils, fuels, and all those things, taking consideration of the high unemployment rate and other issues. And also it will also help in the locations to say, how best can we do it? Because in other areas, but I'm happy that the government is doing something, because when you look at the RDP houses that are being built now, there's a solar energy attached to each house, which is helping sort of to comply on this issue. But I feel that there's a lot of things that needs to be done. And like it goes back to that climate change charter that was presented by the advocate to say, this thing cuts across. Climate change cuts across. It doesn't belong to Department of Environment. No. It cuts across because there's farming there. There's water department. There's all department, and it goes back to me to say, really, if we can push for that charter, and it can also help us to deal with this thing. But I still say there's a lot of awareness that needs to be done. It need not be top-down approach, because once it's top-down approach, the community won't take it. You won't have that achievement of a change behavior, but it needs to be bottom up. That means let's start now. I'm talking to the NGO and the department to say, let's start now changing our approach. Let's start at the bottom and then go up. Then we'll see that bit by bit, people will start accepting that this is their project, this is their problem. Then let's all hold hands together and resolve it. Really, I'm one person who has sinus, but let me tell you, I went to Japan in 2018 for almost 2 months on waste studies, and I was so happy that even in a single day, I never used any medication for sinus, although the area is very hot. And how they are doing it, they are taking the waste, and that waste that can be, it's being the actual separation at source, that like it's being done like that. They don't have bins. They don't have these heaps of landfill site. When it's collected, like if it's Monday, it's strictly cardboard boxes. If it's Tuesday, it's strictly white paper. And this is how they are doing that. And when we ask how did they do it, they say through situational pieces of legislation. They started very bad, but they ended up now as the best country. There are so many. They can have a big function where there are so many, but you'll never see even a single paper on the ground. Even their trains, they are very clean. And I think we should benchmark with those people and check how best have they achieved their on what they have achieved on climate change. And thank you for this presentation. Really, it tells me, I'm sitting here and I'm disappointed. I'm saying that really we can't be a country that is not complying. We need to do something, but we need to strategize to see how best can we do it. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. Who's next? It's Honorable Paulsen. Honorable Paulsen.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you very much for this presentation. And I agree, there's a lot that needs to be done, Chairperson. And unfortunately, it's not being driven with the kind of commitment that it deserves. We've got that Council of the President, where we haven't been party to, that deals with climate change. And I think we need to decide that, just as we've had a Corona Command Council, we need to have a Climate Change Command Council that brings together all the relevant parties. Because if we look at minerals and energy, for example, we've got the seismic surveys being conducted of the Wild Coast. Now, that would add to our carbon footprint, whereas it should be to reduce our carbon footprint. So even our energy resources should be renewable energies, which would be which would drastically reduce the harm that carbon energy sources have on the environment, as well as, for example, alternate building methods which would reduce the carbon footprint of construction on the environment. And we are just not being climate conscious when it comes to our policies that we make. So I would like to know from the presenter if it warrants us to have this level of engagement as we have, because I think the climate emergency is as great as the COVID emergency, if not greater, because as temperatures increase, our chances of survival is as a as a human species comes under greater threat. But we also know that when it comes to the impact of this increase in global temperatures and the effect it has on even food production, it is ultimately the poor that will suffer first. So I'm asking the presenter what he thinks would be the best approach to addressing this emergency that we have. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, dear colleague. Honorable Phillips, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to this team. This was a really, really amazing presentation. Really enjoyed all of it. I don't actually have any questions. I've actually just got some comments or an observation. I think the big problem in South Africa is poverty. It's very difficult to convince somebody to worry about climate change, which they can't see if their stomachs are empty. So it's basically priorities. And very often people say it's only well-off people who can care about the climate, because you don't need to fight daily. But I think that if you look at people who care about something they can't see, they're usually quite caring people. So they care very, very much about the things they can see, like the hunger and the poverty in our world. And I would love to, the committee or the people that did the presentation, if you can tell us what it is that we can help you with to get an improvement going in the meantime, until we can get the charter going through Parliament, as we spoke about. But if you can just give us some guidance, since you've made this presentation to us, and what actions do you actually want us to take? Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, dear colleague. Honorable Mchunu. Kunu. How do we do it? Kunu. I'm going to come and visit just for that this December.
Definitely.
It's Honorable Singh who continue to confuse me, you know.
And thank you for the presentation. It is very informative, and I think it really helps us to get more understanding and to be more to think more about the issues of climate change. Chair, I think we need as a portfolio committee to get and also to try and get all the other departments and other portfolio committees so that we have a coherent way and interdepartmental collaboration when it comes to these issues. But I think that one it's for us as a portfolio committee, but also this is a good opportunity for us to start engaging more with the NGOs, with everyone who is concerned, so that we can move faster towards getting the solutions to the challenges that we are going to face. And it's frightening when you look at the disasters and everything that we might end up in if we don't act fast as a country in trying to resolve this problem that we are faced with as a world. But also, Chair, it's also to check with the presenters that is it possible for them to also get further to assist us in looking at the long-term competitiveness and climate resilience of the economy of this country as we move on. But I was also interested, Chair, is my last point on the clean coal strategy. I know when you go through it and you try and research on it, you find that some fantasy. And given the fact that we are so affected, and we as the country, we rely on the coal as a source of energy currently, whereas coal is also polluting our environment. It produces these greenhouse gases that are so dangerous to our climate. What is it that they think effectively can work in dealing with that particular matter of getting towards the clean coal and or new coal, or all those strategies that they presented them, and the role of us as Parliament or as the portfolio committee in ensuring that we get there. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Sister Mbeka. Then from my side, I think I also have some few issues that I want to raise. Maybe to welcome also the eye-opening presentation. I should think moving forward, we need to also have thematic areas wherein maybe the center can come and make presentation and share with. But like what I said earlier, we cannot underestimate your role as an NGO. So we value you as a very critical stakeholder. But then having said that, one want to ask, what would you like us as legislatures to do when you say, or science says 1.5 degrees world equals to 3 degrees South Africa? considering the fact that climate change mitigation only has the desired impact when we act multilaterally than South Africa doing its own thing. And then the issue here is what should we do above the commitments outlined in our NDC that you are already part of too. Then the other issue that one want to get clarity on is whether any South African products have been subjected to carbon border taxes. And then the issue is here is whether countries are allowed to unilaterally impose carbon border taxes on traded goods according to the trade rules of the World Trade Organization. And then the other issue that one want to get clarity on is how do environmental NGOs like yourselves see your participation in the Presidential Climate Commission? Are you not becoming part of the executive's decision-making processes, as you will have to adopt certain positions on this executive forum, especially if you occupy certain decision-making positions? One would like to hear your views to that effect. And then the other issue here is that as this collective, we do understand that a strategic environmental assessment is one of the tools for environmental management in our country. How does this happen in the real world in terms of climate change? So I should think if you can deal with that. Then the other issue that I think I have omitted is with regard to the climate tracker, which talks about South Africa's emissions reduction targets, that they are saying they are low or insufficient. The issue here, when it's said they are insufficient, it's insufficient relative to what? Is it insufficient relative to technological and financial support that South Africa receives? Or maybe one would like to understand what criteria does climate tracker use to measure our performance as a country as inadequate? So those are the issues that one want to raise. Paulson, is it a new hand or an old one? Did you omit something, Paulson? Honorable Paulson? Sounds like it's an old hand. Then I can hand over to you. CER. You will allocate these responsibilities, Brandon, and the other colleagues that are here. But I can hand over to you. I see you are ready, Brandon, to respond and comment on some of our concern and issues raised. Over to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I hope I will address most of the questions and comments, and then I'll ask my colleague Nicole to come in as well, where I might have missed out on some of them. So firstly, in terms of what can the committee do, just as an overarching question, it's not really one answer to that, but there are a few key things that would be good to get started. I think to support the process of getting a really strong climate change act. So the bill, as we've seen it, is has got some good mechanisms in it, but it's also missing a lot of the issues that we spoke about, or they need to be strengthened or fine-tuned. So we are, as Honourable Singh asked, we are very keen to be very involved in that process. We will certainly be submitting comments, and we are happy to engage with the committee on general levels or to go into specifics. We are partnered with a wide range of experts that deal with specific aspects of this, and can certainly bring them in. So we'd more than welcome that opportunity. In terms of awareness, Mr. Luki raised, and one of the honourable members as well, Yes, so this is obviously an issue. I mean, in the circles we work in, we actually do a lot of popular education. A lot of our partners do that sort of thing, helping to raise awareness. And I think, as was mentioned, this needs to be a bottom-up approach. I think it's a case of bottom-up and top-down to get that sort of climate literacy going on. And of course, the more people understand the issues, the better. Although it's worth pointing out that some of the climate crisis response will come from individuals who start to understand what the issues are and make certain choices and support an appropriate climate crisis response. But a lot of it's systemic as well. Ordinary people don't have a choice of how their electricity is generated. So we mustn't get stuck in thinking we need a lot of the population to get to understand things to change the crisis. It's also a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach. In terms of people employed in the coal value chain, yes, that's absolutely a challenge. I think there's something like 100,000 workers directly involved in that value chain, and then there are obviously sort of ancillary businesses and employment as well. And this is where the whole issue of the just transition comes in. And interestingly, the climate change bill is, to my knowledge, the only piece of pending legislation that actually deals with this process of a just transition. And the whole purpose of the just transition is to make sure that no one gets left behind. So we have to decarbonize. It's an emergency. There's no choice. But what about the people who potentially stand to get prejudiced by that process? So the idea is that they also get taken into account. And just to give a very simple example, it's things like people working in the coal value chain being reskilled to work in renewable energy. That's a very kind of simple, basic example, but gives you an idea of what the just transition is about. It's about a lot more than that as well. So the Presidential Climate Commission, for example, is working on a just transition framework, which is also going to help map the way of how we take care of these particular issues. In terms of the climate action tracker, so when they say our rating is insufficient, so it's insufficient to stay at the 1.5 degree warming mark. So it looks at a range of factors, but it's basically just saying, do our policies and measures put us on track to 1.5 or 2 or 2 point something, whatever the case is. And from that point of view, we are deemed insufficient. And I think nearly all the countries in the world are at this point in time, because obviously the climate response is something that's kind of gaining momentum as we go along. And most of the countries, including ourselves, are starting to go in the right direction. In terms of the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, so that's sort of come into force now, but it really starts getting implemented from 2023 onwards. So it's around that time that we're probably going to start seeing those levies actually coming into force, and that's when the pressure starts coming on our exporters. Madam Chair, I don't know where that sits in terms of the World Trade Organization rules and how legitimate it is in terms of that framework. But in general terms, I think most of these global bodies are starting to acknowledge the need for climate change response. So you'll probably find that the WTO's rules would get amended to take that into account if there's a clash there. In terms of the comment that NGOs are, in a sense, becoming part of the executive through the Presidential Climate Commission. So the commission is there in a predominantly advisory function, and it's constituted of civil society, labor, business, SOEs, etc., etc. So, and because of those different constituencies, there's a balance of power, which hopefully will ensure that the kind of advisory function that gets exercised is good. So I wouldn't say necessarily puts anyone in the position of the executive, but obviously that advisory function can be quite powerful. Then I think something that needs to happen is that this thing of fragmentation and different sectors and departments pulling in different directions in terms of climate change is something that this committee can help us with a lot. So we've got our NDCs, we've got our statements, we've got our climate response sort of mapped out to some extent already. But then, as was mentioned, we have issues like more fossil fuel exploration going on, like an SEZ in Limpopo, which is going to be incredibly carbon intensive, still on the cards. And some of the decisions made around energy. We've still got a new coal being proposed, a lot of new gas energy. And these things don't tie up with the NDCs and with our stated ambitions. So somehow that's all got to get pulled together, and we need to start seeing an end to certain elements pushing in a climate destructive direction. In terms of clean coal, just to confirm that there's no such thing as clean coal, and from a climate point of view, there never will be. Burning coal cannot ever be clean. When they talk of clean coal, it does take certain pollutants out to some extent, which is obviously better for communities living around those areas, but it's still not great. And from a climate point of view, it's nothing that's really viable and is not going to be viable. In terms of getting colleagues from DMRE and water and sanitation and agriculture into these conversations, I mean, we would so welcome that. And that again speaks to this fragmentation and make sure that everyone starts pulling in the same direction as far as climate response goes. And then Honorable Philip spoke of poverty, and that's absolutely an issue. And the sort of implication there is that it's a luxury to consider things like the climate. The problem is that the climate crisis actually just exacerbates these inequalities and issues like poverty and other vulnerabilities. And conversely, addressing the climate crisis by starting to create a climate resilient society can actually start reversing those kind of social pressures. I mean, if we were serious about climate change response, we would, for example, be taking this issue of water availability extremely seriously. And by addressing that sort of thing, we can start to empower communities, provide, strengthen ecosystem services, and really start creating a better life for all. That's what the potential of a solid climate response has. So it is potentially, it's scary from the point of view that it can be thought of as expensive to address the climate crisis properly, but it's nothing near what the cost would be if we don't. So it's a delicate balancing act, this thing of the economy, the climate, the environment, but really by responding appropriately to this crisis, we have an opportunity of increasing the socio-economic well-being of the people of the country. Nicole, I don't know, is there anything you'd like to come in and add?
I think you've covered everything, Brandon. Thank you so much. I mean, sorry, I'm just turning my camera on. I would maybe just add that, I mean, insofar as this particular issue goes, it's important, I think, to acknowledge the context that not only is this an enormous issue in terms of the scope, but also just in terms of the time sensitivity of it. I mean, I can't think of many other issues where in fact, like the climate crisis, we really only have less than a decade to take the necessary mitigation action to reverse the worst effects of what will happen in future. And so it's a fairly unique situation, and unfortunately what that means is that we don't have very much time to get the necessary legislation and regulations in place as a bare minimum on top of everything else that needs to happen. So I mean, I do think that these are fairly unusual circumstances that certainly require the best efforts of everyone who can do something. And I mean, I really appreciate I think we all appreciate the questions from the committee members around what the committee can do. And I think Brandon's really put some good points forward there. And we would really be grateful for an opportunity to also make a written submission to that effect. I mean, there are many colleagues at the Centre for Environmental Rights who also have some thoughts on this, I can assure you. And also just to note that there are a number of NGOs, including youth groups, who've been doing this work and climate activist work for many years, and I think it's also very important that their voices be heard in these conversations, and that I also think that the committee would benefit from hearing the submissions of our youth activists who are really facing difficult questions about what their futures might look like in a world impacted by the climate crisis. And we have commissioned a number of reports. So again, we ourselves aren't the experts when it comes to the science or the energy modeling, but we rely extensively on credible, independent experts. And I think, Honourable Mkhunu, you asked about. I also understood your question to be what, if not coal, then what? And I mean, there's excellent modeling by the Energy Research Centre, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, that essentially shows that we can have an electricity system that meets demand quite easily, that doesn't include any new coal, and that in fact that would be the cheaper way of proceeding. So a least cost electricity system for South Africa going forward is one that's predominantly made up of renewable energy resources, with some flexible generation capacity coming from alternative options like storage, for example. So there are various experts who are doing precisely this work, and again, we would be very happy to forward the committee those expert reports. They do make for very insightful reading. But yes, I mean, I also realize it's now late in the evening, and this is a very voluminous subject. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and it's been an honor to be able to engage with you all this evening, and I really hope that that we can have more engagements like this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lois. And Nicole, sorry. I think it has been also a pleasure on our part to have this engagement with your good selves. And then can we take this as ongoing? Because like I said, you have got a very crucial role in helping us to plug the gaps. And can you share with us those reports that you have, so that out of that, then we can be able to develop thematic areas wherein we can continually engage. We'll put you also in our program in the next year, so that at least if it means once a month, we can also engage with your good self on areas that will be topical and of then the current affairs of that particular moment, then can assist us to do our oversight work with this also outside information that will be coming from your part. Having said that, before we become counterproductive, and I can see there's no hand that is here, we need to call it a night, dear colleagues, because we are still going to continue tomorrow evening. Can we do that so that you have a deserved rest? Then tomorrow you go to your caucus meetings, then to the house, then we'll reconvene again tomorrow to continue with the other NGOs. Thank you so much, the colleagues from the CER. We sincerely appreciate you having approached us so that you share this information that is very crucial and in relation to the work that we do. Thank you so much. Then thank you, colleagues. Then the meeting gets adjourned till we meet tomorrow. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.
Good night.
Good night.
Night. Thank you, Brandon and Tim. Good night, our whip. You can rest now.
Recording stopped.